Hi everyone, my name is Megan Clark, and today I want to talk about how the data entered into HMIS affects each of the measures in the System Performance Measures report that is submitted on your behalf to HUD. At the conclusion of this presentation, I hope that everyone leaves with a better understanding of what the System Performance Measures report is and how data entry affects each measure. The System Performance Measures report is a required report submitted to HUD that is generated from a community's HMIS data. This report looks at how each community's homeless system is performing. It's important to note that while the report is looking at the data at the system level, each agency that enters into the HMIS is reflected. Additionally, HUD uses this data as a competitive element in the annual application for COC funding. The System Performance Measures report technically consists of 7 measures. However, Measure 6 is not relevant to any COC, so I have decided to exclude it from this presentation. The measures we are going to review are length of time persons spend homeless, returns to homelessness, the total count of persons experiencing homelessness, income growth, only for COC-funded projects, persons experiencing homelessness for the first time, and successful placements and retention. Before we dive into which elements are included in each measure, it is important to note that there are 9 elements that play heavily into this report. Let's review each one. Intake date/project start date determines who was in each project at the start of the reporting period. Date of birth identifies persons over the age of 18, as well as is used to deduplicate clients. Social Security number is used to deduplicate clients as well. Approximate date homelessness started determines the date when a person first began experiencing homelessness. Housing move-in date identifies persons who have been housed in a permanent or rapid rehousing project and are no longer experiencing homelessness. Income and sources is used at project start, annual assessment, and discharge to measure income growth. Effective date is the annual assessment that is required to be completed for each person in a COC-funded project for a year or more. This element is used to calculate income growth. Discharge date indicates that a client is no longer in a project and may no longer be experiencing homelessness. And finally, destination. This element identifies the type of destination a person was discharged to. Measure 1 first looks at a client's admission date to gauge when the client was enrolled into a program. It then looks at date this episode of homelessness started. This becomes the first day the client began experiencing homelessness. It is imperative that data entry staff are updating this element every time a client is entered into a project. Not updating this element could overinflate the length of time a client is experiencing homelessness. For example, if a client has been served in an emergency shelter 7 times over the last 3 years and has been then housed either temporarily or permanently every time they were discharged, but the approximate date this episode of homelessness has not been updated in their admission record since their first admission 3 years ago, this client will still have a length of time homeless as 3 years. For clients enrolled in permanent housing or rapid rehousing projects, the report then looks at a client's move-in date. Recording the date that a client moves into a permanent housing project is one way to end an episode of homelessness. If a client has moved into a permanent housing unit, even if they are still enrolled in the project, a move-in date recorded will indicate the client's no longer experiencing homelessness. Without this date, the client will still be counted as experiencing homelessness. The final element the report looks at is a client's discharge date. Being discharged from a project will also end an episode of homelessness. It is important for this element that the discharge date recorded is the actual date the client left the program and not a later date, as this could overinflate the time a person is experiencing homelessness. This is what Measure 1 looks like when submitted to HUD. The report compares the average number of days clients experience homelessness in the current reporting period to the year prior to see if the number of days has increased or decreased. The HMIS team looks at the client's level detail in this report and investigates all client records with lengths of time homeless greater than 90 days to see if the information in HMIS is accurate or if it needs to be updated. Measure 2 looks at a client's discharge date and then the destination that was recorded in HMIS. This element is only looking at clients who were discharged to a permanent destination and then returned to a homeless project. This measure specifically looks for clients who were discharged in the 2 years prior to the reporting period to a permanent destination and then returned to a project at any point from their discharge date through the end of the reporting period. It is important to note that a client who was discharged from a street outreach or shelter project to permanent housing situation could be counted as a return to homelessness if being homeless is a requirement of the project. Only returns after 14 days of discharge from a transitional, permanent, or rapid rehousing project to a permanent destination are counted as returns to homelessness. It is expected that clients who are discharged from these projects and enrolled into another transitional, permanent, or rapid rehousing project are moving through continuum care or moving from one permanent housing project to another. Again, this is what the measure looks like when we submit to HUD. I do believe that this measure isn't entirely reflective in terms of returns to homelessness, as we talked about on the previous slide, as someone who exited emergency shelter to a permanent housing project could be counted here. But it is important to look at this measure to determine who is moving from one project to another versus who is discharged and then actually returned. Measure 3 looks at the total number of persons in the homeless system and compares this to the year prior. Because this measure looks at multiple projects, making sure that the system can deduplicate is imperative. Otherwise, a client could be counted multiple times, inflating numbers. HMIS relies on unique identifiers to produce an unduplicated count in the HMIS. Name and date of birth are useful unique identifiers, but the Social Security number is very helpful for deduplicating clients where name and/or date of birth might be the same. Discrepancies in this information can prevent the HMIS from assigning a universal client ID, which will count a client with multiple project enrollments as one person. We know that a client may decide to give their Social Security number to one project while declining to provide it to another, so at that point, the system will rely on being able to match as much as possible to the name and date of birth. When submitted to HUD, this measure looks at both the annual point-in-time count from the current year to the year prior, as well as the annual count of persons in emergency shelter and transitional housing as entered into HMIS. As with the other measures, if there is a significant increase, communities should look into this and determine if this data is a data entry error or if there really was an increase in persons served. Measure 4 looks at income growth in COC-funded projects at admission, annual assessment, and discharge. Before I explain how this measure is programmed, it is important to note that any client who is missing this information at admission, meaning client doesn't know, client refused, or data not collected, was recorded for the income question in the admission record, is automatically excluded from this measure. Even if the client gained income at annual assessment or discharge, they will not be counted. This is why it is important to collect and enter this data. Date of birth is also important for this measure, as only persons over the age of 18 are required to have this income information collected, even adult family members. Any person in a household age 18 or above should be asked for this information. When submitted to HUD, the measure is broken down into stayers and leavers. A stayer is a person age 18 or older who was enrolled for at least 1 year during the reporting period. A leaver is any person who was discharged from a project during the reporting period. Again, any person missing this information at admission will not be counted in this measure. The income for each person type, stayer or leaver, is then broken down and looked at by employment income and non-employment income, such as supplemental security income or public assistance. For stayers that were in project for only 1 year, this measure looks at their income at admission and income at their most recent annual assessment. Remember, an annual assessment is an update to the HMIS info section of the person's face sheet within 30 days of the anniversary of the head of household's admission date. The system will not record an update as an annual assessment if the effective date in HMIS is not within this time frame. This is why it is important to not only enter a date for the assessment, but to also update the income information as it has changed. For stayers that have been in project for 2 years or more, meaning they have already had an annual assessment completed prior to this reporting period, the system compares the two most recent annual assessments. For leavers, this measure is only looking at income at admission and discharge. Leavers that were discharged from a project prior to having an annual assessment completed, their income information from their admission record will pre-populate into their discharge form. If their income has increased, the user must update this information on the discharge form. Leavers that have had an annual assessment completed, their income information from their assessment will pre-populate into the discharge form. Again, if their income has increased, the user must update the income information on the form. We have seen instances for both stayers and leavers that a user will enter an effective date for an annual assessment without updating the income information when there was in fact an increase, because they did not update the amount of income that was already pre-populated in the record. The HMIS team sends out messages to projects with missing annual assessments to remind them that they need to be completed. But on our end, we wouldn't know if a client did in fact have an increase in income. It is up to the user to enter this information. Measure 5 is a count of persons who experience homelessness for the first time during this reporting period. To do this, the system looks for a person's earliest admission date into a project and then looks 2 years back to see if there is any record of that same person in any project. If there is a record within this time frame, they will not be counted as becoming homeless for the first time. If there is no record of them being in a project within the 2 years prior, they would then be counted as becoming homeless for the first time. As we mentioned in Measure 3, this measure relies on the deduplication of client records. A client could have been in an emergency shelter and then enrolled into a rapid rehousing project, but if the system is unable to deduplicate that client, they could be counted as first-time homeless in both the emergency shelter and rapid rehousing project, even though their rapid rehousing project stay would not be the first time they were homeless. Any significant increases from the prior year should be looked at to see if it is a data entry issue where a client is unable to be deduplicated across project stays, or if something happened that is genuinely causing an increase in numbers. Measure 7 is looking at successful destinations from street outreach, emergency shelter, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, and permanent housing. In order to be considered a successful placement, the destination must be recorded as anything other than a homeless situation or missing or unknown destinations of client doesn't know, client refused, data not collected, no exit interview completed, or other. Destinations of other should never be used as there is no way to quantify this. We often see users putting other as the destination and then typing in a specific destination. The destination response does not have to be the exact destination, but should be the destination that most closely identifies where the person was discharged to. Anytime a user is unsure which destination response should be selected, they can reach out to the HMIS team for assistance. We also have a list of destination response options available on our website. This measure is broken down into 3 sections: discharged from a street outreach project, discharged from emergency shelter, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing projects without having a move-in date recorded, and either discharged from or stayed in a permanent supportive housing project with a move-in date recorded. For rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing projects, this is why users must record the move-in date, if and when a person physically moves into a unit, regardless of whether they have been discharged from the project or not. The expectation for persons enrolled in rapid rehousing and have a move-in date recorded were discharged to permanent destination, and therefore the report is only looking at people discharged without that move-in date recorded to see if the destination is considered successful. The final part of the System Performance Measures report looks at the data quality of the system. The first part is relevant to HMIS bed coverage. meaning the number of projects, other than domestic violence projects, that are dedicated to persons experiencing homelessness are actively entering data into the HMIS. The ultimate goal for accurate reporting is to have all projects that are listed on the HIC entering data into the HMIS. Low bed coverage can result in losing points on the application. Finally, the report looks at the number of persons served by each project type and then discharged during the reporting period to determine how many people are missing discharge destinations. Again, this is why it is important to do everything possible to avoid response options of client doesn't know, client refused, data not collected, no exit interview completed, or other whenever possible. For more information, we have created a document to go along with this presentation using information provided from our HMIS vendor that explains in detail the data elements that are included in each measure, and this is available on our website.